"You're lucky I even let you sit at this table," my son-in-law said, laughing as he reached for his glass, and that was the moment I realized I had been far too patient for far too long. The room didn't go silent the way it does in movies, no one dropped a fork or gasped, but something shifted, subtle and sharp, like a crack forming under polished glass, and I saw it in my daughter's hands first, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of her plate, knuckles pale, her shoulders drawing in just slightly as if she could make herself smaller without anyone noticing. I didn't say anything. I never did, not at first. I've learned that people reveal more when they think no one is paying attention, and for months now I had been paying very close attention. Dinner was supposed to be simple that night, just the four of us in their suburban home outside Denver, a quiet neighborhood with trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, the kind of place that looks peaceful from the outside, the kind of place neighbors wave politely and never ask questions. I had brought a casserole still warm in its dish, something Emily used to love when she was younger, back when she laughed easily and didn't glance at someone else before speaking. She was 7 months pregnant now, carrying her first child, and there should have been a softness in the room, a kind of careful joy, but instead there was tension threaded through everything, invisible but constant, like a low hum you can't turn off. Daniel poured himself another drink, more than he needed I thought, though I didn't comment, and he kept talking, his voice just a little too loud, just a little too sharp, each joke aimed not at the room but at her. "Pregnancies made her useless," he added, almost casually, like it was just another observation, and he smiled as if expecting agreement. Emily forced a small laugh. It didn't reach her eyes. I watched her push her food around the plate, barely taking a bite, and I remembered how she used to eat, how she used to sit at my kitchen table years ago, talking about her day, her dreams, her plans, all of it spilling out of her without hesitation. That girl felt very far away now. I set my fork down carefully, aligning it beside my plate, the motion precise, controlled, because control matters in moments like this. You don't rush. You don't react. You observe. That's how you understand the shape of the problem. Daniel leaned back in his chair, stretching like he owned not just the house, but the air inside it, and he looked at me briefly, almost as an afterthought, as if I were part of the furniture, something that had always been there and didn't require attention. That was fine. Underestimation is a useful thing. Emily glanced at me then just for a second, and there it was again, that flicker of something she didn't want to show, fear mixed with apology, as if she were somehow responsible for the way she was being spoken to. I held her gaze a moment longer than usual, not enough to make a scene, just enough to let her know I had seen it. I always see it. And as Daniel kept talking, unaware or unconcerned, I realized this wasn't a single bad evening or a careless comment said in poor taste. This was a pattern. A quiet, practiced pattern that had been unfolding for longer than anyone wanted to admit. I had heard hints of it before, in the pauses during our phone calls, in the way Emily would change the subject, in the careful way she chose her words, but hearing it in person, watching it play out across a dinner table set with matching plates and folded napkins, made it undeniable. I reached for my water, took a small sip, and set the glass back down without a sound. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't defend her. Not yet. There is a time for speaking and there is a time for listening, and that night I was listening very closely because I already knew something he didn't. I had not come to that dinner unprepared. I had noticed the changes long before that night, not in anything obvious, not in bruises or raised voices, but in the small quiet shifts that most people overlook because they do not know where to look, and for a long time I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into ordinary moments, because that is what mothers do when they want to believe their children are safe. Emily had always been the kind of woman who filled a room without trying, not loud, not demanding, but present in a way that made people listen when she spoke. And yet over the past year, that presence had thinned into something careful and measured, as if every word had to pass through an invisible filter before it was allowed to exist. The first time I felt it was during a phone call on a Sunday afternoon, something we had done for years without fail, and she had paused before answering a simple question about her day, just a second too long, just enough for me to hear it, and then she had laughed softly and changed the subject, as if the question itself had been inappropriate. I remember standing in my kitchen, looking out at the backyard, watching the wind move through the trees, and thinking that the silence between her words felt heavier than the words themselves. After that, I started paying attention. Not in a way that would alarm her, not in a way that would push her further away, but quietly, carefully, the way you observe something fragile that might disappear if you move too quickly. There were other moments. A visit where she arrived 10 minutes late and apologized 3 times before even taking off her coat, her eyes darting briefly toward her phone as if she expected it to ring at any second. A dinner where she barely touched her food and insisted she was not hungry, even though she had driven nearly an hour to get there. A conversation about the baby where she spoke about everything in practical terms, schedules, appointments, budgets, but never once about how she felt, never once about excitement or fear or anything that sounded like anticipation. It was all logistics, as if the emotional part had been set aside or perhaps taken from her. And then there was Daniel, always polite with me, always respectful in a way that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. The kind of politeness that creates distance instead of warmth. He would shake my hand instead of hugging me, call me ma'am instead of using my name, smile without showing any real interest in what I said. At first, I thought it was just his personality. Some people are like that, reserved, controlled, but over time I began to notice the contrast between how he spoke to me and how he spoke to her when he thought no one was listening closely. It was never loud. That was the thing. If it had been loud, it would have been easier to confront, easier to define. Instead, it was subtle comments disguised as jokes, questions that were not really questions, corrections delivered in a tone that suggested he was simply being helpful. I remember one evening in particular months ago, when I stopped by unannounced with a basket of groceries, and I heard his voice from the hallway, calm, measured, saying something about how she should be more careful with money, how she had always been irresponsible, and I remember the way she responded, not with anger, not with defense, but with immediate agreement, as if the statement had already been accepted as truth. I did not announce that I had heard it. I stepped back outside, waited a moment, then knocked on the door as if I had just arrived. That was when I understood that whatever was happening in that house was not something that would reveal itself openly. It would require patience. It would require evidence. And so I began to collect small pieces of information, not in a dramatic way, not like someone building a case, but in the quiet way that experience teaches you over time. I paid attention to the bank statements she casually mentioned, the way she described needing to check with Daniel before making even minor decisions, the way she hesitated when I suggested she visit for a weekend, as if the idea needed approval. I spoke to her neighbor once, under the pretense of asking about a local service, and she mentioned, almost offhand, that Emily rarely left the house alone anymore. None of these things were enough on their own. That is how situations like this survive. Each piece is small. Each moment can be explained away. But together, they form a pattern that is impossible to ignore once you allow yourself to see it. By the time that dinner invitation came, I was no longer uncertain. I was no longer asking myself if something was wrong. I knew it was. What I did not know was how far it had gone, or how much damage had already been done. And that is why I accepted the invitation without hesitation, why I arrived with a warm dish and a calm smile, why I sat at that table and listened to every word as if it mattered, because it did. Every word tells you something if you are willing to hear it. And I was listening very carefully. By the time the main course was cleared and replaced with something sweet that no one seemed interested in eating, I had already heard enough to confirm what I had suspected for months, but confirmation is a quiet thing. It does not arrive with noise or certainty. It settles into your chest with a weight that feels both heavy and clarifying at the same time. Daniel kept talking, not because anyone asked him to, but because he enjoyed the sound of his own voice, and more than that, he enjoyed the control it gave him over the room, the way each comment subtly redirected attention, the way each remark about Emily was framed as concern but landed as criticism. He asked her why she had not scheduled the nursery furniture delivery yet, even though she had mentioned earlier that the company had delayed it by 2 weeks, and when she repeated that explanation, he smiled in a way that suggested she was being forgetful rather than inconvenienced. He corrected the way she described her next doctor appointment, insisting it was on Thursday instead of Friday, and when she hesitated trying to remember, he reached for his phone to prove his point, not because it mattered but because being right mattered to him. I watched her accept it, watched her nod and adjust her words, watched her shrink her own certainty to accommodate his version of events. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. That is what makes it so effective. No one interrupts something that appears reasonable on the surface. No one defends a person who seems to agree with the correction. I let my gaze move slowly between them, not staring, not challenging, just observing, collecting, confirming. The house itself was immaculate, every surface clean, every object in its place, a kind of order that suggests control rather than comfort, and I realized that even the environment reflected him, precise, contained, leaving very little room for anything spontaneous or imperfect. Emily reached for her water, her hand brushing the glass lightly before she lifted it, and I noticed again the slight tremor, small enough that someone less attentive might miss it, but I had seen it before in different moments under different circumstances, always when he spoke to her in that same measured tone. I thought about the way she used to speak when she was younger, how quickly she would defend her ideas, how easily she would laugh at herself when she made a mistake, and I compared it to the careful way she now chose each word, as if every sentence carried a risk she was trying to manage. That is when I understood something that had not been clear to me before. This was not just about what he said. It was about what she had learned to expect. It was about anticipation. The kind that makes you adjust before anything happens, the kind that reshapes a person from the inside out. Daniel set his glass down with a soft click and leaned forward slightly, his attention returning to her as if the rest of the room had faded away, and he asked her in that same calm voice, whether she had finally figured out how to manage her time better now that she was not working as much. It was phrased as a question, but it was not a question. It was a statement disguised as curiosity, and I saw the way her shoulders tightened before she answered, the way she took a small breath, as if preparing for something that had already happened many times before. She said she was doing her best. He nodded slowly, as if evaluating that answer, as if deciding whether it was acceptable, and then he gave a short laugh that did not carry warmth, only judgment. I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, not yet, but clarity, the kind that removes hesitation. I had come to that dinner to observe, to confirm, to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with, and now I did. There would be no confrontation fueled by emotion, no raised voices or dramatic declarations. That is not how you deal with someone like him. People like Daniel rely on that. They rely on others reacting visibly so they can redirect, dismiss, or deny. No, this required something else. Something quieter. Something precise. I reached for my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my plate, my movements steady, deliberate, giving myself a moment to think not about what I felt, but about what needed to be done. Emily glanced at me again just for a second, and this time there was something different in her eyes, something that had not been there earlier in the evening, not quite hope, but something close to it, something that suggested she sensed a shift she could not yet name. Daniel did not notice. He was too focused on maintaining his version of the conversation, too confident in the pattern he had created. That confidence was his weakness. He believed this was just another dinner, just another evening where his words would shape the outcome, where nothing would challenge him in a way he could not control. He was wrong. I had not come to that table to argue. I had come to end something quietly, in a way he would not be able to ignore or explain away, and as I looked at him, listening to the last of his comments fade into the background, I knew exactly when that moment would come. The moment arrived in a way that would have seemed ordinary to anyone who was not paying close attention, and that was exactly why it mattered, because the most important shifts in power rarely announce themselves. They slip into place quietly, almost invisibly, until everything feels different and no one can quite explain why. Daniel had just finished another comment, something about how Emily should be grateful that he handled most of the important decisions, his tone light, almost playful, but his eyes fixed on her with an expectation that she would agree, and she did, of course she did, with that same small nod I had seen too many times already. I did not react immediately. I let the silence settle just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough to draw his attention without forcing it. Then I reached for my glass, took a measured sip of water, and set it back down with care, my movements slow and deliberate, giving myself space to act with precision rather than emotion. I stood up from my chair, not abruptly, not in a way that would signal confrontation, but simply as if I needed to adjust my position, and I walked around the table, each step steady, unhurried, until I was standing beside him. He looked up at me then, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, not concern, not yet, just curiosity, as if he were trying to understand what I could possibly have to add to a conversation he believed he controlled. I leaned down slightly, just enough that my voice would not carry beyond him, just enough to create a moment that belonged only to us, and I spoke quietly, clearly, without hesitation. I have everything on you. I did not raise my voice. I did not repeat the words. I did not add anything to explain or soften them. I simply let them exist exactly as they were, and then I straightened back up, returning to my seat as if nothing unusual had happened. The effect was immediate, though subtle to anyone not watching closely. His posture changed first, the relaxed confidence in his shoulders tightening into something more rigid, his hand pausing halfway to his glass before completing the motion with a slight delay, as if he needed an extra second to remember how to move naturally. He did not look at me right away. Instead, he stared down at the table, his expression carefully neutral, but there was a tension in his jaw that had not been there before. Emily noticed it too. I could see it in the way her eyes shifted between us, searching for something she did not yet understand, sensing the shift without knowing its source. Daniel cleared his throat softly, a small, controlled sound, and attempted to continue the conversation as if nothing had changed, but the rhythm was gone now, the ease replaced by something strained and uneven. He made another comment, something less pointed this time, something safer, and when Emily responded, he did not correct her. He did not interrupt. He simply nodded once and let her words stand. It was a small change, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. That is all it takes sometimes, not a complete reversal, not an immediate transformation, just a break in the pattern. I folded my hands in my lap, my expression calm, my posture unchanged, giving him nothing to push against, nothing to challenge or dismiss. The power of a statement like that is not in what is said, but in what is implied, in the questions it creates, in the uncertainty it introduces. He did not know what I knew. He did not know how much I knew. And that uncertainty would do more work than any accusation ever could. The rest of the evening unfolded differently. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from the outside, but in a series of small adjustments that, taken together, shifted the balance of the room. Daniel spoke less. When he did speak, his tone was measured in a different way, not controlled for dominance but controlled for caution. He avoided looking directly at me, his focus staying on his plate or on Emily, but without the same edge as before. Emily, in turn, seemed to relax slightly, not fully, not yet, but enough that her shoulders lowered, enough that her responses came a little more naturally, as if the pressure had eased just enough for her to breathe. I did not intervene again. I did not need to. The message had been delivered. The seed had been planted. And as I sat there, listening to the quieter, more careful version of the conversation that followed, I knew that this was only the beginning, not of a confrontation, but of a change that he would not be able to control, no matter how carefully he tried to maintain the image he had built. The rest of the evening moved forward with a careful kind of politeness that had not been there before, and while nothing outwardly dramatic occurred, the difference was unmistakable if you knew where to look, because control, once disrupted, never fully returns in the same way. It fractures, it hesitates, it begins to question itself. Daniel finished his drink more slowly than usual, his eyes occasionally flicking toward me and then away again, as if he were trying to decide whether what he had heard was a bluff or a certainty, and that uncertainty sat with him, shaping every word that followed. Emily noticed it too, though she did not understand it, not yet, but I could see the way her posture softened just slightly, the way her responses came a little easier, as if the invisible pressure she had been managing all evening had loosened its grip by just enough to allow her a moment of relief. When dessert was cleared, I stood and offered to help with the dishes, something I had done countless times before, and Emily followed me into the kitchen without hesitation, leaving Daniel alone at the table for a moment longer than he seemed comfortable with. The kitchen light was warmer, softer than the dining room, and for the first time that evening, there was a sense of separation, a small pocket of space where his presence did not dominate every movement. Emily moved quietly beside me, rinsing plates, placing them carefully in the dishwasher, her hands still slightly unsteady but more focused now, as if the simple task gave her something solid to hold on to. I did not speak immediately. I let the quiet settle around us, not empty but intentional, the kind of silence that invites truth rather than demands it. After a moment, she glanced at me, her expression searching, uncertain, and I saw the question forming before she asked it. "What did you say to him?" Her voice was low, careful, as if even the walls might carry the sound back to him. I dried my hands slowly, turning to face her, and for a brief moment, I saw the same young woman she used to be, the one who looked to me for guidance without hesitation, the one who trusted that I would know what to do. Nothing he did not need to hear. I said, my tone even, not dismissive but not revealing either. She frowned slightly, not out of frustration but out of confusion, her eyes searching mine for something more specific, something she could hold on to. He acted different, she said quietly, almost as if she were afraid of saying too much. I nodded once, acknowledging what she had already seen. People tend to change their tone when they realize they are not as untouchable as they thought. I did not say more than that. I did not need to. The idea itself was enough to settle into her mind, enough to begin shifting the way she saw the situation she had been living in for so long. She looked down at the counter, her fingers tracing the edge of a clean plate, and I could see the thoughts moving behind her eyes, the small adjustments in understanding, the way a new possibility was beginning to take shape. For a long time she had accepted his behavior as something fixed, something that could not be challenged without consequence. But now there was a crack in that belief, small but significant. "Mom," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, carrying something that sounded almost like hesitation. "Is there something I should know?" It was a careful question, not direct, not demanding, but open enough to invite honesty. I considered her for a moment, weighing not what I could say, but what she was ready to hear, because timing matters as much as truth. "There are things you have been overlooking," I said calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "And there are things he has been counting on you not to question." Her breath caught slightly, just enough for me to notice, and she looked away for a second before returning her eyes to mine, as if bracing herself. "Like what?" I reached for a towel, folding it slowly, giving her time to steady herself, to prepare for what comes next when someone begins to see their own life more clearly. "Patterns," I said simply. "The way he speaks to you. The way you respond. The way decisions get made without you feeling like you have a choice." I paused, letting the words settle, letting her connect them to her own experiences rather than forcing the connections myself. "You have been adapting to something that should not require adaptation." She did not answer right away. She did not argue or deny it. Instead, she stood there in the quiet kitchen, her hand resting lightly on the counter, her eyes distant for a moment as if replaying scenes in her mind, placing them into a new context, seeing them not as isolated moments, but as part of something larger. That is how awareness begins. Not with a dramatic realization, but with a series of small recognitions that slowly reshape the way everything fits together. From the dining room, I could hear the faint sound of a chair shifting, the subtle movement of someone who was no longer entirely at ease, and I knew that Daniel was listening in his own way, trying to interpret the silence, trying to decide whether he still held the same position he had assumed all along. I turned back to the sink, rinsing the last of the dishes, my movements steady, controlled, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had already begun to shift. When we returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be undone, even if no one acknowledged it out loud, because once awareness enters a space, it does not leave quietly, it lingers, it reshapes the way people move, the way they speak, the way they think about what comes next. Daniel looked up as we stepped back in, his expression composed, almost neutral, but there was a tightness around his eyes now, a calculation that had not been there before, as if he were trying to reassess something he had always taken for granted. Emily walked slightly ahead of me this time, not by much, just a step, but it was enough to notice, enough to suggest a subtle shift in how she carried herself, and I watched the way she took her seat without immediately looking to him for direction or approval. It was a small change, but small changes are where everything begins. I returned to my chair and folded my hands in my lap, allowing the silence to stretch just a moment longer than usual, not uncomfortable but deliberate, the kind that makes people aware of themselves in a way they cannot easily ignore. Daniel cleared his throat again, a habit he had begun repeating more frequently since earlier, and attempted to restart the conversation with something casual, asking about my drive over, about the traffic, about anything that would restore a sense of normalcy. I answered politely, my tone calm and even, giving him nothing to push against, nothing to interpret as hostility, because confrontation would have given him a direction, and I had no intention of offering him one. Instead, I let him sit with uncertainty, let him wonder what I knew, how much I knew, and what I might do with it. Emily listened quietly at first, but I could see the difference in her posture now, the way she no longer leaned inward as if bracing herself for correction, the way her hands rested more naturally on the table instead of gripping the edge of her plate. When Daniel made a comment about the upcoming doctor visit, this time she corrected him without hesitation, her voice steady, her words clear, and for a brief second, he looked surprised, not because of what she said, but because she had said it without seeking confirmation. He did not challenge her. He simply nodded once and moved on. That was when I knew the shift was taking hold. It does not happen all at once. It happens in moments like that, where a person chooses, even unconsciously, to stop adjusting themselves to fit someone else's expectations. I leaned back slightly in my chair, observing, allowing the interaction to unfold without interference, because this part was not mine to control. This part belonged to her. From the outside, it might have looked like a normal conversation, a family dinner winding down, but beneath it, something else was happening, something quieter and far more significant. Daniel reached for his glass again, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he were aware of being watched even when no one was looking directly at him. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had been interrupted, and that interruption created space for doubt, space for reconsideration, space for consequences he had not previously accounted for. Emily spoke again, this time about something unrelated, a small detail about preparing the nursery, and there was a lightness in her tone that had been missing earlier, not full relief, not yet, but the beginning of it, the kind that comes when pressure is reduced just enough to allow a breath. I watched Daniel as she spoke, noting the way he listened without interrupting, the way he allowed her to finish her thought, something he had not done earlier in the evening, and I understood that he was recalibrating, adjusting his behavior in response to something he could not fully define. That is the power of uncertainty. It forces change without direct confrontation. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a way that felt more noticeable now, each second carrying the weight of what had already shifted and what was still to come. Eventually, Daniel stood, offering to clear the remaining dishes, a gesture that might have seemed considerate under different circumstances, but here it felt more like an attempt to regain control of the situation, to re-establish himself as someone who directed the flow of the evening. Emily did not stop him, but she did not defer to him either. She simply watched, her expression thoughtful, as if seeing him from a slightly different perspective than before. I remained seated, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged, allowing the scene to play out without inserting myself into it, because the most important work had already been done. Not through argument, not through force, but through a single moment that introduced doubt into a structure that had depended on certainty. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet sounds of dishes being moved and water running in the kitchen, I knew that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a shift that would continue long after I left that house, a shift that neither of them could ignore, no matter how much they might try to pretend that nothing had changed. By the time the evening began to wind down, the shift in the room had settled into something steady, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but not yet fully understood by the people living inside it. And that is often how change begins, not with clarity, but with a quiet disruption that forces everyone to move differently without quite knowing why. Daniel returned from the kitchen with a dish towel in his hand, drying his hands more slowly than necessary, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if he were trying to regain a sense of rhythm that no longer came naturally. He sat down again, but not in the same relaxed way as before, his posture more upright now, his attention divided between the table and me, even when he tried to pretend otherwise. Emily remained where she was, her gaze following him for a moment before shifting back to the table, her expression thoughtful, not withdrawn as it had been earlier, but alert in a way that suggested she was noticing things she had not allowed herself to notice before. I did not speak. I did not guide the conversation. I let the silence expand just enough to make it present, just enough to encourage something new to take its place. Daniel attempted another comment, something about work, about a project he had mentioned earlier, but his voice lacked the same edge, the same certainty, and when Emily responded, she did not rush to agree or adjust herself to his tone. She simply answered calmly, directly, and when she finished, she did not look at him for approval. She looked at me. It was brief, just a second, but it was intentional, and in that moment, I saw the beginning of something that had been missing for a long time, a sense of alignment, not dependence, not a return to the past, but a recognition that she was not alone in the room anymore. Daniel noticed it too. I could see it in the way his eyes followed that exchange, the way his expression tightened slightly before smoothing itself out again, as if he were recalculating something he had always assumed was fixed. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms loosely, a gesture that might have appeared casual, but carried a subtle defensiveness now, a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of the evening had shifted in a way he could not fully control. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second marking the distance between what the evening had been and what it was becoming. Emily spoke again, this time asking me a question about a family recipe, something simple, something familiar, and I answered with the same calm tone I had maintained all night, giving her space to continue to lead, to exist without interruption. Daniel listened, but he did not insert himself. He did not redirect. He allowed the conversation to move without him guiding it, and that, more than anything else, confirmed what I already knew. Control, once questioned, does not reassert itself easily. It hesitates. It waits. It looks for certainty before acting again. After a while, Emily stood, gathering the last of the dishes from the table, her movements steady, her steps measured but no longer tentative, and she carried them to the kitchen without asking if anyone needed anything else. Without pausing for instruction, Daniel watched her go, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual, and then he turned back to the table, his eyes briefly meeting mine. There was a question there, unspoken but clear, and I held his gaze without offering an answer, without confirming or denying anything he might have been trying to understand. Uncertainty does its work best when it is allowed to remain unresolved. He looked away first. It was a small detail, but details matter. I stood shortly after, smoothing my hands over the edge of the table, my movements unhurried, signaling that the evening was coming to a close without needing to say it out loud. Emily returned from the kitchen just as I reached for my coat, her expression softer now, more grounded, as if something inside her had shifted into place, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the way she stood, the way she breathed, the way she looked at the space around her. "I will walk you out," she said, her voice steady, and I nodded once, allowing her to take that step, to make that choice without interference. Daniel remained where he was for a moment, then stood as well, his movements slower, more measured, as if he were still adjusting to the new shape of the evening. As we moved toward the door, the house felt different, not because anything visible had changed, but because the dynamic within it had been interrupted, and interruptions, when handled correctly, create openings that cannot be easily closed. At the door, Emily paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle, and she looked at me again, this time without hesitation, without that layer of uncertainty that had defined her earlier in the night. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, but there was something more in her tone now, something that did not need to be explained. I met her gaze, holding it just long enough to let her know I understood, just long enough to reinforce what had already begun. "I will always come when it matters," I replied, my voice even, my meaning clear without needing to be expanded. Daniel stood a few feet behind her, silent, watching, and I could feel his attention without turning to face him. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply observed, the way I had observed him all evening, and as I stepped out into the cool night air, I knew that whatever certainty he had relied on before had been replaced by something far less comfortable, something that would follow him long after I left, something he would not be able to dismiss or ignore. And sometimes that is enough to begin everything that comes next. The night air was cooler than I expected, the kind that settles into your lungs slowly and forces you to breathe a little deeper, a little more deliberately, and as I walked down the short path to my car, I could feel the weight of the evening shifting into something quieter, something that no longer needed to be carried in the same way. I did not look back right away. There was no need. I already knew they were standing there just inside the doorway, each of them processing what had just happened in their own way, trying to make sense of something that had not been explained, something that could not be easily dismissed or reinterpreted. I reached my car, unlocked it, and paused for a moment before getting in, allowing the silence to settle fully around me, free from the tension of that house, free from the careful balance I had maintained at that table. Only then did I glance back. The porch light cast a soft glow across the doorway, outlining their figures in a way that made the distance between them more visible than it had been all evening. Emily stood slightly forward, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, her posture steady, no longer folded inward, no longer shaped by the need to anticipate someone else's reaction. Daniel stood behind her, not far, but not close enough to suggest the same quiet authority he had carried earlier, his stance more uncertain now, his presence less defined. He was watching her. Not directing. Not correcting. Just watching. That alone told me everything I needed to know about what would come next. I got into the car and closed the door. The sound firm but not loud. A simple boundary between what had been and what would follow. As I started the engine, I saw Emily step slightly forward, just one step. But it was intentional, and she raised her hand in a small wave, her expression calm, thoughtful, and for the first time that evening, I saw something that looked like clarity in her eyes. Not complete understanding, not resolution, but awareness, the kind that changes how a person sees every interaction that comes after it. I returned the gesture with a brief nod, then pulled away from the curb, letting the headlights trace the quiet street ahead. The drive home was uneventful, the roads mostly empty, the houses passing by in a steady rhythm that allowed my thoughts to settle without interruption. I did not replay the evening in detail. I did not analyze every word or gesture. That part was already done. What mattered now was what had been set in motion, not what had already occurred. Change does not happen in a single moment. It unfolds, it builds, it tests itself against resistance, and I knew there would be resistance. There always is. But something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be easily undone. By the time I reached my house, the sky had deepened into that quiet blue that comes late in the evening, the kind that makes everything feel still, contained. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before getting out, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my mind not racing, not restless, just steady. Inside, the house was exactly as I had left it, everything in its place, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the background, and I moved through it without turning on unnecessary lights, letting the familiar space ground me in a way that required no effort. I set my keys on the counter, removed my coat, and poured myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I stood by the window, looking out at the darkened yard. Somewhere, not far away, a car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the street before fading again into the distance. I thought about Emily, about the way she had looked at me in the kitchen, the way her voice had shifted, the way her posture had changed by the end of the night, and I understood that what she needed now was not instruction, not direction, but space to see clearly, space to decide what she would do with that clarity. I would not rush that process. I would not interfere unless it became necessary. There is a difference between helping and taking over, and I had no intention of repeating the same pattern I had just interrupted. I set the glass down and turned off the light, letting the room settle into darkness, the kind that feels calm rather than empty, and as I made my way toward the hallway, I felt no urgency, no need to act immediately, because the most important action had already been taken. Somewhere in that quiet house across town, a pattern had been disrupted, a certainty had been replaced with doubt, and a person who had learned to make herself smaller had taken the first step toward remembering that she did not have to. And sometimes that is where everything begins, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a single moment that changes the way someone sees their own life. And once that happens, nothing ever fits the same way again. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet start that does not demand attention but still carries the weight of what came before it, and I moved through it with the same steady rhythm I had practiced for years, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light settle into the rooms without forcing anything to change too quickly. I did not reach for my phone right away. I did not expect a message, and I did not need one. Whatever had been set in motion would take time to reveal itself, and rushing that process would only distort what needed to unfold naturally. By mid-morning, the sun had risen high enough to warm the kitchen floor, and I stood by the window for a moment, watching the stillness of the neighborhood, thinking not about what I had done, but about what Emily might be doing now, how she might be replaying the evening, how the small shifts she had felt would begin to rearrange the way she understood her own life. When the phone finally rang, it did not startle me. I had been expecting it, not at a specific time, but in the general sense that awareness, once awakened, seeks confirmation, seeks something solid to hold on to. I let it ring once, twice, before answering, giving her the space to decide whether she truly wanted to speak. "Mom," she said, her voice quieter than usual, but not uncertain, not the way it had been before. There was something new in it, something grounded, as if she had spent the night thinking, not avoiding. "Are you busy?" I glanced around the kitchen at the stillness, at the cup of coffee cooling slightly on the counter. "No," I said simply. "I am here." There was a brief pause on the other end, not empty but full of something forming, something she was choosing how to say. I did not sleep much, she admitted, and I could hear the faint exhale that followed, the kind that comes when someone allows themselves to speak honestly after a long period of holding back. I kept thinking about everything you said, about the patterns. I did not interrupt. I did not fill the silence. I let her continue at her own pace because this part belonged to her, not to me. I started noticing things, she went on, her voice steadier now, more certain with each word. Not just last night. Things from before. The way I apologize all the time. The way I check with him before I do anything, even small things. She paused again, and this time the silence carried recognition rather than confusion. I did not realize how much I had adjusted. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of emotion but out of acknowledgement, because this was the moment that mattered, not the dinner, not the words I had spoken, but this quiet realization forming in her own voice. Awareness changes everything, I said calmly. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There was another pause, longer this time, and I could hear movement in the background, the soft sound of something being set down, perhaps a cup, perhaps a phone shifting in her hand. He has been different this morning, she said after a moment, and there was a note of surprise in her tone, as if she had not expected it. Quieter. Careful. I nodded, even though she could not see it. Uncertainty does that, I replied. It makes people reconsider what they thought was certain. She let out a small breath, not quite a laugh but close, and I could hear the difference in it, the absence of that tightness that had defined her voice for so long. I do not know what I am going to do yet, she said, and this time there was no hesitation in admitting it. But I know I cannot keep pretending nothing is wrong. You do not have to decide everything today, I told her. You only have to stay aware of what you see and trust yourself not to ignore it. The line went quiet for a moment, but it was not the kind of silence that feels uncertain. It was steady, grounded, the kind that comes when someone is thinking clearly for the first time in a long while. Thank you, she said finally, and this time the words carried weight, not obligation, not politeness, but understanding. I did not respond immediately. I let the words settle, let them exist without adding anything unnecessary. I will be here, I said after a moment, my tone even unchanged but certain. Not to decide for you, just to remind you that you can decide for yourself. When the call ended, I set the phone down and returned to the window, the light now brighter, more defined, casting clear lines across the floor. Outside, nothing had changed. The same houses, the same quiet street. But somewhere, not far from here, a different kind of change was already taking hold, not loud, not visible, but steady, and once that kind of change begins, it does not stop easily. It moves forward one realization at a time, until the life that once felt fixed no longer fits the same way. And when that happens, a person does not need to be told what to do next. They already know.